Sir R. Raj Rao, author, professor of English literature at Pune University and one of India's leading gay rights activists. Sir, welcome.
Thank you.
We will begin our discussion with your own writings.
I have been writing for almost 25 years now, so it's been, a varied output. I've written poetry, short stories, novels, a biography of the poet Nissim Ezekiel, lots of critical writing and non-fiction, academic papers and newspaper columns, so it's been different things that I've been doing, different kinds of writing that I have done. My creative writing, of course, is poetry and fiction and also a few plays. This is what I regard as important, but the other work is equally important. The critical work is important. My biography of the poet Nissim Ezekiel still remains the only biography of a post-independence Indian poet in English. And then I've done some translations as well. A recent book of mine, a recent publication of mine is a translation of Lakshmi. Lakshmi is a transgender activist, and her autobiography, which first came out in Marathi, has been co-translated by me along with P.G. Joshi, and we've translated this into English, and Oxford University Press has just brought it out. So the different things I've done, and I think that that's how it should be. A literator must be able to practice different forms of writing and not just concentrate on one form. We're talking about multimedia, but within writing, I think there has to be a multimedia nature to it.
So the entry in Wikipedia about you begins almost like this. You are one of the leading gay rights activists in India. So could you elaborate on the kind of activism that you are involved in?
See, there are different kinds of activism, and my activism is literary and academic. It's not the activism of, say, people like Ashok Rao Kavi, who founded the Humsafar Trust in Bombay way back in 1990, or Bindu Madhav Khire, who founded the Sampathik Trust in Pune about 10-15 years ago, because that is grassroots activism. It has to do with field work and outreach work and so on. And but I'm not in that sector. I don't have a support group or anything. But I think that I think I've said this several times, that writing and activism are two sides of the same coin, not just for people like me, but for anyone who's concerned with with identity issues. Take Dalit literature. Take a writer like the late Namdev Dhasal. I'm sure it was the same for him, that his writing and his activism were two sides of the same coin. I guess it's the same for many women writers. So activism, yes, but activism through art and literature. And this is something that people don't understand. Marginal literatures, I think, have often been misread as literatures that have an agenda, that literatures that are propaganda, and that literatures that are inferior in terms of artistic ability. And all this is not true. It has to be dispelled, because one can have issues about which one is writing, and one can also be artistic and literary. Even Commonwealth literature began with that, I mean, wouldn't you say a writer like B.S. Naipaul or Salman Rushdie, don't they have issues that they are tackling in their work? And yet they're part of the canon. Whereas with gay writing particularly, and I'm not the only one to be saying this, there are others who would endorse what I'm saying. Somehow the feeling is that if you call yourself a gay writer, then it means your politics are being foregrounded and your art is taking a back seat, and that's not at all true. So actually, I'm not sure whether I like the word activist, because the moment you invoke a word like activist, this is what people think. That writing is only an excuse for making political statements. But that's not how it is. My training is that of a literary scholar. I teach in an English department. I've been teaching for more than 25 years. And I think that for me, literary values in a work are as important, if not more important, than what you're writing about. So that's my position. And also that if you take gay fiction, at the end of the day, it's about love. We don't make such a big issue when writers write about heterosexual love, which everybody is doing. So I don't even like to use the word gay sometimes, because it's love. I mean, in some cases it's heterosexual love, in other cases it's homosexual love, but it's love. It's a love story. My novel, The Boyfriend, is a love story. My second novel, Hostel Room 131, is also a love story. My forthcoming novel, Lady Lolita's Lover, is also a love story. If the characters concerned belong to the same gender, that's just an accident. That's how I see it.
So when we talk about your boyfriend, it deals with homoeroticism in a very apparent way, and it almost borders onto pornography or something like that. So how will you respond to such a?
No, I'm very happy if you say that, because I don't have a moral position vis-a-vis pornography. I don't. If I say pornography is bad, then I'm assuming a very moral positionality, which is not what I do. I have frequently said that gay writing needs its own aesthetic. I recently said this at a conference, that gay writing does need its own aesthetic, and what that aesthetic would entail is also sexual explicitness, right? Now, one can go into the reasons for that and ask why gay love stories are more sexually explicit than heterosexual love stories, though I'm not sure that that's always the case. But it is certainly part of my aesthetics, and so if you say verges on pornography, that makes me happy. It doesn't offend me. I don't believe in censorship and self-censorship, and I think that one must write as freely as one can, without bothering about offending people and so on, without worrying too much about worrying if something is obscene or vulgar or so on. I think that one has to write, and sex is very much a part of life. So to say that you can't express it in a novel or in a short story or in a poem, I think is being a hypocrite. So I'm totally against self-censorship, where writers think that, well, this is offending, and of course we are living in times where you've got to be careful, because I think we are living in terrible times as far as censorship is concerned, and you don't want to do things that might get you into trouble for no reason if it can be avoided or if it can be said in a roundabout way. That's a nice thing about English, incidentally, that a lot of the time you get away saying what you want to say, because the people who are likely to take offense don't even understand what you're saying. With the regional languages, they don't have that luxury, because whatever they say is immediately taken at face value. But no, I mean, pornography is all right. I'm not making a distinction between pornography and non-pornography. If I want to write a sex scene, I'll write a sex scene. And if my publishers and editors don't have a problem with it, and they let it be, then I think that it's nobody else's business to worry about it.
Okay, so you consider it as a matter of openness of the society?
Yes, yes. The other thing I wanted to say is that when I write a homosexual novel or short story or play or poem, I'm not self-conscious about it. and I'm not apologetic about it. There's a lot of gay writing, particularly in the regional languages, which tends to be apologetic. So it operates at a level where the person concerned is trying to come out to parents, is trying to come out to friends, and is having a lot of trouble doing that. My work is not like that. My characters are sort of in your face gay, and they realize that just as some people are straight, other people will be gay. So there's no point in being apologetic and and being self-conscious about it. So that's partly why you might read it as pornography, because it is in your face. If you take The Boyfriend, Yudi is cruising. The very first chapter is called Gentleman, and it's set in a train station washroom in Bombay, the Churchgate station. And that has been a hot cruising spot for a long time, and he's cruising there, and he's not worried. Actually, he lives with his mother, but his mother has gone someplace, and he picks up a boy and takes him home because there's no one at home. But he's not self-conscious, or he's not guilt-ridden. What if my mother comes to know? And so I think that for me, being gay also has to do with decentering the idea of normativity. This whole business of being honest and being good and being monogamous and being faithful and being dutiful is a normative idea. So my stories unfold in a way which proves that for me the important thing is to dismantle the idea of normativity.
Professor Rao, you are one of the leading champions of LGBT writing. So could you tell us something about the present position of LGBT writing and its place in the Indian syllabus? And maybe you must have put in some work to bring that into Indian syllabus, no?
Yes, there's a fair amount of LGBT writing by this time. Incidentally, LGBT stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. And by this point, there's a fair amount of it. There are two major anthologies which were brought out by a leading publisher, Penguin, in 1999, so that's a while ago. Yarana and Facing the Mirror. Yarana is gay writing from India, and Facing the Mirror is lesbian writing from India. But about 3 years ago, another anthology of queer writing came out. It was called Out, Stories from the New Queer India. And there have been full-fledged novels, there have been my novels, but there have been other novels and short stories as well that people have been writing. So I think the body of gay writing and lesbian writing it has existed and it will continue to exist. Then there has been the other kind of critical writing, of which there's also been quite a lot until this time. And these are by mainstream scholars. There's the book Phobic and Erotic. There's the book Same-Sex Love in India, readings from literature and history, edited by Ruth Manita and Salim Kidwai. There's the book Because I Have a Voice. There's the book Forbidden Sex Texts, written by Hoshang Merchant. And all these were published by major publishers. The publishers are Macmillan and Penguin, Routledge, Seagull. So the two kinds of writing go on simultaneously. There is the literary representation of same-sex love in the fiction and the poetry that we have, and then there's also the theorizing of it in these other books that I mentioned. So what happens is that by this point, there's also my own book, Whistling in the Dark, 21 Queer Interviews, which is made up of interviews with LGBT people. And the nice thing about that book is that it talks to people across a spectrum of values. So there are university professors, but there are also people who work as, say, auto drivers and so on. That book was almost done the way a sting operation is carried out, and my publisher Sage at that time was very cooperative. They allowed the book to go to press without even getting sort of written consent from some of the respondents, because we changed their names and so on. And we pointed out to them, to the publishers, that since we were asking very personal questions, people wouldn't give their consent, so we sometimes didn't even tell them that we were interviewing them for a book and so on. So there's all that work. So what happens at this point is that there's enough fiction, poetry, drama. There's Mahesh Dattani's plays as well, which I forgot to mention. And there's enough theoretical material available to start a very good university course at the PG level or even at the UG level. And in my own university, the University of Pune, I have been offering the course that I call it Queer Theory and Literature, but the syllabus calls it Alternative Literature. 2. Alternative Literature. 1 is Dalit writing, Dalit Sahitya. The University of Hyderabad has been offering a course for a long time. I think Kalyani in West Bengal, because wherever there are LGBT people on the faculty, you can be sure that they will want to start a course like that. So there's Niladri Chatterjee at Kalyani, there's Oshang Merchant in Hyderabad, there's me in Pune, and then other universities. JNU, I think, has had several dissertations on LGBT studies. Delhi University, the major universities and even the smaller ones, I think, are catching on. The thing about research is that one is obliged to look for new things to research, and in a way it's a bit opportunistic, because people just want to latch on to the bandwagon. So there's a lot of research going on which is not coming from conviction or anything. It's just that researchers are desperate to look for new areas of research, but the end result is that there are courses that are being taught, there's research at the MPhil and PhD levels, and that's going on. All this is a good thing, and I think the future for LGBT studies in Indian universities is bright. In Western universities, it has already been around for a long time, but Indian universities are finally, I think, catching on, and I think the years to come will see more and more work in this direction.
Professor Rao, there's something that's called cultural wars that has taken place in American universities, no? So is there something that is taking place, something that's similar to that in Indian universities with regard to the maybe inclusion of Dalit literature, LGBT studies and all that? Do you find some kind of resistance, or you find the opening up a very easy process?
No, it may not be easy. Like I just said, if it's visible now to a greater extent than it was visible earlier, it's partly because of the opportunism of teachers and students who are looking for new areas to research. This does not necessarily mean that they've overcome their own conservatism. And that's what I meant by saying that there's a bit of hypocrisy here, because they may be conservative and yet they find that they have to be open to new areas of learning and new systems of knowledge and new kinds of research. Also, furthermore, the change happens more in the cities than in the smaller universities. So the universities that I mentioned are, of course, the metro universities. In the smaller universities, in the undergrad colleges, I'm not sure whether the same changes are reflected there. Because academia tends to be conservative. Academia, I think, is the slowest to take note of changes that go on around us. I mean, there are English departments that are still stuck with Shakespeare and the writers of the English literary canon, and they are completely unwilling to go beyond that and explore new areas and new territories. So it's varied. I don't think in a country as vast as India you can generalize. There would be universities which are very forward-looking and even radical, but equally there would be lots of other university departments of English which are extremely conservative. This conservatism is a result of lethargy on the part of teachers who are unwilling to acquaint themselves with newer things. I mean, I'm sure there are lots of teachers who still depend on their own notes which they took during their own student days, and this is what they do in the class. So there's all kinds of universities, and I don't think one can generalize, but a change has been made, a beginning, not a change, a beginning has been made, and I hope, I'm optimistic that as the years go by, we'll see a greater willingness. Let me put it that way. We'll see a greater willingness on the part of teachers and students to acquaint themselves with new things.
Professor Rao, from the academic side, we will move on to the social side. Recently, the Supreme Court of India has again recriminalized same-sex love and same-sex intercourse and things like that. So how will you comment on such a verdict and its impact on the Indian society?
I think so much has been written about this in the newspapers, in the media. I myself write a weekly column for a tabloid newspaper in Pune, and frequently talked about this judgment and its implications. Needless to say, it's extremely unfortunate that a judgment like that came out. I might tell you that nobody expected it. Everybody thought that the Supreme Court would uphold the Delhi High Court judgment of July 2009. So I think it came as a big blow and a big shock to all concerned, including people in the legal profession. I was reading a book called Courting Injustice. It's by a lawyer by the name of Rajesh Talwar, and he was one of the first people to file a petition in the Delhi High Court for the scrapping of Section 377, even before the Naz Foundation did it. And his book came out before the 2013 judgment. And he says somewhere in the book that, he almost takes it for granted that the Supreme Court will uphold the verdict of the Delhi High Court. So when that 11th December judgment of 2013 came out, it was a big shock to all of us and a very unfortunate thing to happen. So what can one say? I mean, Supreme Court judgments are final and binding. They can't be challenged, although there is a curative petition pending in the Supreme Court to rehear the case. And that in a way is the only option now. The government certainly isn't going to do anything about changing the law. So that's where we are, and it's a big setback. I mean, there's nothing more I can say, because you can't appeal against a Supreme Court judgment, and it's a big setback because technically it even makes an interview like this a criminal activity, because if a certain kind of love is illegal, then talking about it and writing about it should also be illegal. So that's where we are. I mean, I think it's a stalemate, and we are up against a wall, and I don't know.
Okay, Professor, thank you so much.
Thank you. I enjoyed giving you this interview.
Okay.
And I hope it's useful to the students who will see the program. Thank you.
Welcome to the session on Aesthetics of Romanticism. Romanticism was an artistic movement that took place during the late 18th century in Europe. It chose intuition and emotion over rationalism. This, together with the ideologies and events of the French Revolution, laid the foundations from which both Romanticism and the Counter-Enlightenment emerged. At that time, Europe was engrossed in an industrial revolution, and society began to challenge conventional forms of neoclassicism in art, music, and literature. The generation of revolution and wars, of stress and upheaval, produced doubts on the security of the age of reason. Doubts and pessimism now challenged the hope and optimism of the 18th century. People felt a deepened concern for the metaphysical problems of existence, death, and eternity. It was in this background that Romanticism was born. The essential spirit of Romanticism was one of revolt against an established order of things. Romanticists fought against precise rules, laws, dogmas, and formulas that characterized classicism in general and the late 18th century neoclassicism in particular. They praised imagination over reason, emotions over logic, and intuition over science, and thus made way for a vast body of literature of great sensibility and passion. The term romantic first appeared in the 18th century English and originally meant romance-like, that is, resembling the fanciful character of medieval romances. In the 17th century, we find the word employed in two different senses. When the Englishman Thomas Bailey used the adjective romantic for the first time in 1650, it was to criticize the untruth of fictional writings. At the same period, romantic was applied in a positive sense to the landscape paintings of Claude Lorraine, Nicolas Poussin, and Salvator Rosa. So, in parallel to the motley, untamed inventiveness of the fictional world, we have the picturesqueness of depictions of nature informed with emotion. Later, it began to suggest a movement whose central characteristics were revolt, self-expression, and individual uniqueness. Beginning in the last decades of the 18th century, it transformed poetry, the novel, drama, painting, sculpture, all forms of concert music, especially opera and ballet. The roots of Romanticism can be traced in the work of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Immanuel Kant. Other philosophers and writers associated with the Romantic movement include Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph von Schelling, and George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel in Germany, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and William Wordsworth in Britain. Philosophically, Romanticism represents a shift from the objective to the subjective. The importance of romantic philosophy in aesthetics can be delineated through a simple example. Imagine three people looking at a landscape. One is a farmer, another a property developer, and the third an artist. The farmer would see the potential for raising crops and livestock, the property developer the chance to build houses, and the artist at the shades and subtleties of color and form. None of these individuals is seeing the landscape objectively. They are seeing it from a particular or subjective viewpoint. The move from the objective to the subjective is a result of Kant's idea that human beings do not see the world directly but through a number of categories. We do not directly see things in themselves. We only understand the world through our human point of view. If we agree with Kant that we can never know things in themselves, we may as well discard them. This leads to idealism, the belief that what we call the external world is somehow created by our minds. The Enlightenment's emphasis on the empirical deterministic universe left little room for the freedom and creativity of the human spirit. The Romantic emphasis is on art, and imagination is a direct critical reaction to the mechanical view of some Enlightenment figures. The Romantic landscapes are a good example for this. In landscape art, Romantics picked subjects that elevated nature, often dwarfing the human in comparison. Sometimes Romantic art depicted sentimental and heroic figures. These seemed small in relation to the forces of nature. Yet humanity remained a focal point of their work. Nature is portrayed as vague, powerful, and barely restrained. Frederick's Wanderer Above the Sea and Fog shows a solitary gentleman looking out over a seascape with breakers smashing against the shore. The figure seems to contemplate the elements with stoic determination mixed with admiration and awe. The wanderer is focused on nature, even while all of nature seems focused upon him. The ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau about nature and simplicity, from Johann Gottfried Herder, who rejected classicism and searched for authenticity of the true people, and the fascination with medieval times, they all seem to meet harmoniously in Frederick's paintings. In Romantic age, instead of an aesthetics based on inescapable values, there developed in England and France a doctrine of the beautiful based on individual taste and sensibility. The feeling and sentiment of the individual artist and viewer of art now became the key factor. Ultimately, this implied a turn to a psychological approach to art, which by the middle of the 19th century began to concentrate on its more sensational aspects. In the book A Philosophical Enquiry into the Origins of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful, published in 1757, Edmund Burke paved the road to an aesthetics of awesome and pleasurable terrors. After Burke's attempt to base the visual arts on a theory of human passions, the categories of the grand and sublime, the archaically rugged, the mental stimuli provoked by the bizarre, obscure, chaotic, even the shock effects which exposed the depths and abysses of the human soul, came increasingly to figure in European thinking as the motive forces behind truly compelling works of art. Around the time of Burke's treatise, the concept of the picturesque became a key term. The word connoted psychological moods triggered by certain themes and also by certain modes of formal depiction. Uvedale Price published essays on picturesque in 1795. Followed by this, around the turn of the century, Richard Payne Knight argued that picturesqueness was based above all on values of light and color. A short time later, this was put into practice by William Turner in watercolors and oils of a decidedly romantic flavor. Now let us look at the contributions of some other important thinkers who played major roles in shaping the Romantic age. Generally, these thinkers felt that for human beings, it was our own day-to-day living that was the center of our search for the truth. Reason and the evidence of our senses were important, no doubt, but they mean nothing to us unless they touch our needs, our feelings, our emotions. Only then do they acquire meaning. This meaning is what the Romantic movement is all about. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is considered as the intellectual father of Romanticism. For Rousseau, habits, values, rules and standards imposed by a civilization grounded in reason and reason only had to be abandoned. Man is born free and everywhere he is in chains, Rousseau had written. Whereas the philosophers saw man in common, that is, as creatures endowed with reason, the Romantics saw diversity and uniqueness, that is, those traits which set one man apart from another and traits which set one nation apart from another. Discover yourself, express yourself was the slogan of the Romantic artists. Play your own music, write your own drama, paint your own personal vision, live, love and suffer in your own way. The Romantics were passionate about their subjectivism, about their tendency towards introspection. Rousseau's autobiography, The Confessions, began with the following words: I am commencing an undertaking hitherto without precedent and which will never find an imitator. I desire to set before my fellows the likeness of a man in all the truth of nature, and that man myself alone. I know the feelings of my heart and I know men. I am not made like any of those I have seen. I venture to believe that I am not made like any of those who are in existence. If I am not better, at least I am different. Arthur Schopenhauer. Arthur Schopenhauer was born in February 22nd, 1788 in Danzig, Prussia. In 1819, he published his greatest work, The World as Will and Idea. To Schopenhauer, the phenomenal world is basically an illusion. The true reality, Kant's thing in itself, he refers to as will. It is out of the will that everything derives, but it has more the qualities of a force and pushes or drives what we perceive as the phenomenal world. Will is the inner nature of all things. So, if you want to understand some things or someone's inner nature, you need only look within yourself. So the will also drives us through our instincts. Aesthetic salvation, seeing the beauty in something or someone, he believed, is one of the ways to get past suffering. When we do this, we are actually looking at the universal or essence behind the scene, which moves us in turn towards the universal subject within ourselves. This quiets the will that forces us into the phenomenal world. Schopenhauer believed that music was the purest art, one step from will. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Goethe was born in 1749 in Frankfurt am Main in Germany. Goethe's greatest work is his two-part play Faust. Although he began writing it in 1773, it would not be finished until 1831. The first part, however, could stand alone, and it was completed in 1808. Its theme was human freedom and the power of passion. In addition to his poetry, novels and plays, Geats spent considerable time on science. He studied medicine, anatomy, physics, chemistry, botany and meteorology. In 1792, he completed the two-part contributions to optics, and in 1810 the three-part on the theory of colors. He truly believed that it was these works that would be his greatest contributions. Instead, few scientists approved of them, and they were to make little serious impact on the field. His work would make an impression on various artists, though including Turner, Klee and Kandinsky. His approach was really more phenomenological than experimental, and his work reflected more on the subjective experiences of color and light than on their physics. Schelling and Coleridge. Schelling agreed with Kant that the only object we have direct knowledge of is consciousness. The external world is seen as an adjunct to what is more real, the mind. The way that the mind will come to full awareness of itself is through art. Coleridge was interested in the psychology of artistic creativity and was dissatisfied with the empiricist idea that the mind was merely a passive absorber of impressions. After reading Schelling and other idealists, he found a way to criticize the over-mechanical view of the Enlightenment. The mechanical view of the mind is atomistic. It is simply the sum of its experience. Coleridge saw the mind more in organic terms, its functions more like an organism than an engine. The organism can be creative, but it is difficult to see how an engine could create poetry. Coleridge felt that his version of idealism could be reconciled with his Christian beliefs, and that Kant's moral theories were in tune with Christian sentiments. Coleridge thought that intellectuals had an important role in disseminating culture in order to bring society closer to a state of harmony. Hegel. G.W.F. Hegel was the most influential of the German idealist philosophers, perhaps the most important philosopher since Kant. He became a professor at Heidelberg in 1816 and was professor of philosophy at Berlin from 1818 until his death in 1831. Like other idealists, he agrees with Kant that the mind is not simply a passive absorber of the external world, but actively organizes it. As the mind cannot know things in themselves, what becomes the real is Geist, mind, spirit or soul. As Hegel says, the real is the rational and the rational is the real. Hegel sees Geist developing through history, each period having a Zeitgeist, a spirit of the age. These stages will eventually reach the telos, Greek for end, of self-understanding, that is when Geist comes to know itself. He called this process dialectical. A dialectical process is one in which a starting position, the thesis, proves to be inadequate and so throws up its opposite, the antithesis. Both of these positions are unsatisfactory, and progress will only occur when a superior understanding occurs. It is only when Geist comes to know itself that we can be free. It is only possible to be free if we understand reality. If we do not understand reality, we are not in a position to make a free judgment. We struggle in vain against that which we do not understand. For Hegel, each person's individual consciousness or mind is really part of the absolute mind. It is just that the individual does not realize this. If we understood that we were part of a greater consciousness, we would not be so concerned with our individual freedom. We would agree with to act rationally in a way that did not follow our individual caprice. By following the real or the rational, each individual would achieve self-fulfillment. The true content of romantic thought, Hegel writes, is absolute internality, the adequate and appropriate form of which is spiritual subjectivity or conscious personality as comprehension of its own independence and freedom. Following Hegel, two different interpretations of Hegelianism spawned two different groups. The old Hegelians, who uncritically accepted Hegel's views, and the young Hegelians, who wanted to continue the revolution of ideas using Hegel's dialectics. Ludwig Feuerbach and Karl Marx were the most influential of these. Søren Abbe Kierkegaard. Søren Kierkegaard was born in Copenhagen on May 5, 1813, the youngest of 7 children. In 1843, he published Either Or. It takes the form of an argument about how to live life between an aesthetic man and an ethical man, very probably reflecting two aspects of Kierkegaard's own soul. The aesthetic man is basically a hedonist and an atheist. Although he is portrayed as a refined gentleman, his sections of the book are rambling, suggesting that his life is likewise without focus. The ethical man is a judge, and his arguments are far more orderly and eloquent. He spends considerable time analyzing the ancient Roman Emperor Nero and his mental states. Throughout his works, he was concerned with passions. He defined anxiety, for example, as the dizziness of freedom. Despair is what the hedonist feels when he finally recognized the emptiness of his life. Guilt is what the ethical man feels when he inevitably discovers his inability to forgive himself. These definitions would profoundly influence a number of later philosophers and writers. Kierkegaard is often considered the first existentialist, mostly because of the way he used the word existence. He said that God doesn't exist because he is eternal. Only people exist because they are always an unfinished product. And the nature of existence is, first, that it is the domain of the individual, and second, that individual must take responsibility for his or her own creation. There is little doubt the great masters of the Romantic period influenced each other, and the mood of the age crossed disciplines. There can be no doubt that Romanticism, though it had an enormous resonance in Germany, was a phenomenon that pervaded all of Europe during the late years of the 18th century and the transition period to an industrialized society in the 19th. It even occasionally overleapt the borders of Europe, for instance, stimulating American painters of the late 19th century to develop a unique version of the style, above all in the field of landscape painting. As far as the unreal and eerie, the dark and evil ingredients of the Romantic mood are concerned, sufficient examples are found in English and French literature and art, where they were indeed often carried to extremes, giving rise to the concept of black romanticism. One power possessed by the Romantic, a power distinct and superior to reason, was imagination. Imagination might apprehend immediate reality and create in accordance with it. the Romantics did not merely say that there were irrational ways of intuiting reality. They rejected materialism and utilitarianism as types of personal behavior and as philosophies. They sought a regeneration we can liken to that of the medieval heretic or saint. They favored selfless enthusiasm, an enthusiasm which was an expression of faith and not as the product of utilitarian calculation. Emotion, unbridled emotion, was celebrated irrespective of its consequences. The three theses of Romanticism can be summarized as: first one, the universe is a single unified whole. Everything is connected to everything else. The world is not simply a collection of unrelated atomic particles and isolated minds. Second, the universe is full of values, tendencies, and life. The universe is not composed merely of lifeless matter. It is not completely objective, consisting only of the formal mathematical properties of matter extended in space and time. Third, reason, objectivity, and analysis radically falsify reality by breaking it up into disconnected lifeless entities. The best way of perceiving reality is through some subjective feelings or intuition through which we participate in the subject of our knowledge instead of viewing it from the outside. We have discussed some of the major thinkers and their concepts which shaped the Romantic age. Now let us wind up this session with a quote from Isaiah Berlin. For the Romantics, Berlin says, in the realm of ethics, politics, aesthetics, it was the authenticity and sincerity of the pursuit of inner goals that mattered. This applied equally to individuals and groups, states, nations, movements. This is most evident in the aesthetics of Romanticism, where the notion of eternal models, a Platonic vision of ideal beauty which the artist seeks to convey, however imperfectly, on canvas or in sound, is replaced by a passionate belief in spiritual freedom, individual creativity. The painter, the poet, the composer do not hold up a mirror to nature, however ideal, but invent. They do not imitate the doctrine of mimesis, but create not merely the means but the goals that they pursue. These goals represent the self-expression of the artist's own unique inner vision to set aside which in response to the demands of some external voice, church, state, public opinion, family, friends, arbiters of taste, is an act of betrayal of what alone justifies their existence for those who are in any sense creative. Here are some questions for you. Romantic art movement did not produce any normed artistic style. Why? Discuss the works of William Blake, Goya, and John Constable according to the concepts of Romantic philosophy. Books for reference: K. Clark, The Romantic Rebellion, 1974. H. Honor, Romanticism, 1979. C. Rosen and H. Zerner, Romanticism and Realism, 1984. A. K. Wiedemann, Romantic Roots in Modern Art. Brown Marshall, The Cambridge History of Literary Criticism, Volume 5. Romanticism, Cambridge, UK, 2000. Hegel, G.W.F. Aesthetics, Lectures on Fine Art, translated by T.M. Knox, Oxford 1975. Hills, Frederick W. and Harold Bloom. From Sensibility to Romanticism, essays presented to Frederick A. Pottle, London, Oxford and New York 1965. Day Iden, Romanticism 1996. Routledge. Ferber Michael 2010. Romanticism, a very short introduction. Oxford and New York, Oxford University Press. Berlin Isaiah 1999. The Roots of Romanticism, London, Cato and Windus. Here we end this session on aesthetics of Romanticism. We will meet again with another topic in the next session. Till then, bye.
Hello and welcome to the session on personality theories of Cattell and Eysenck. Cattell's trait theory of personality. Before going to his theory in detail, let us have a brief idea of his biography. Raymond Cattell was born in 1905 and died in 1998. He was educated in Britain and he obtained his doctorate from University of London, and after which he worked as Director, Child Guidance Clinic for 5 years. He came to the US to work with E.L. Thorndike and developed officer selection methods. He established an institute for personality and ability testing. He taught at University of Illinois for 30 years and more, and went to Hawaii in 1978, and until death he was teaching in the University of Hawaii. Cattell thought that clinicians' observations were not a scientific basis for understanding or classifying personality. He used the inductive method of scientific inquiry to develop his theory of personality. That is, he gathered large amount of data and used factor analysis on the data, looking for clusters. For Cattell, personality was that which permit a prediction of what a person will do in a given situation. The underlying basic factors of a person's personality were termed by him as source traits. He used factor analysis and found common clusters of surface traits. These clusters were termed by Cattell as source traits. He gathered data about the individual from the life records, took self-reports and used the questionnaire data and used tests and obtained test results, which all put together with source traits gave the personality of an individual. Cattell has identified 35 primary traits, of which 23 were characterized of normal individuals and 12 were characterized of abnormal individuals. He developed a scale called 16PF, which was designed to assess 16 different source traits associated with normal behavior. Cattell said that humans are innately driven by ERGs, E-R-G-S, which means goals were created because of hunger, curiosity, anger, fear or other basic motivations which are found in both humans and primates. Cattell believed that intelligence was primarily an inherited trait. Cattell was of the view that personality has to be considered in terms of not only traits but also various other variables including attitudes. He defined attitude as a desire to act in a specific way in response to a specific situation. Attitudes are interconnected within the dynamic lattice. Then what is dynamic lattice? It is Cattell's attempt to display graphically his theoretical analysis of the relationship between the mind's instinctive driving forces and their overlying semantic and attitudinal superstructure. The specific attitudinal connections within the dynamic lattice are controlled by subsidiation chains, that is, some attitudes are subordinate to other attitudes. The subsidiation chain helps determine when specific attitude will produce a specific behavior. Environmental factors were considered essential by Cattell to determine personality and behavior. Cattell's theory of personality attempts to explain the interaction between the genetic and personality systems and the socio-cultural milieu within which the organism is functioning. It dives deep into the complicated transactions between the personality system and the more inclusive socio-cultural matrix of the functioning organism. According to him, these traits are genetically and environmentally determined, and the ways in which genetic and environmental factors interact decide the behavior of the individual. Cattell opines that an appropriate theory of personality must take into account the multiple traits that comprise a personality. The theory should be able to indicate the ways in which genetic and environmental factors interact to influence behavior. He believes that personality functioning and growth must be based on systematic research methods and precise measurements. Multivariate statistics and factor analysis are his preferred methods of personality study. Now, let us learn the formula for personality. According to him, with the help of mathematical analysis of personality, the prediction of behavior can be made by a specification equation. The formula used by Cattell to predict behavior with any degree of accuracy is given here. R is equal to FSP, where R refers to the nature of a person's specific response, F refers to the unspecified function, S refers to the stimulus situation at a given moment in time, and P refers to the personality structure. To be more specific, this formula signifies that the nature of a person's specific response means what the person does or thinks or verbalizes is some unspecified function of the stimulus situation at a given moment in time, and also of the individual's personality structure. The specification equation shows that the person's specific responses to any given situation is a function of all the combined traits relevant to that situation. Here each trait is interacting with situational factors that may affect it. Cattell also accepts that it is difficult to predict a person's behavior in a given situation. In order to increase predictive accuracy, the personality theorist must consider not only what traits a person possesses, but also the many non-trait variables such as a person's moods and particular social roles called for in the situation and related aspects. It's also necessary to weigh each trait according to its relevance to the situation in question. For example, if the person were in emotionally arousing situation, the trait of anxiety would be assigned a high weight in predicting the person's response. Thus, the equation is oversimplification of Cattell's trait theory. Yet, this general formula conveys Cattell's strong belief that human behavior is determined and can be predicted. Next, we can discuss the different categories of traits. According to Cattell, behavior is determined by the interaction of traits and situational variables, but his major organizing concept of personality resides in his description of various kinds of traits he has identified. Traits are relatively permanent and pervasive tendencies to respond with consistency from one situation to another and from one time to another. Traits are hypothetical mental structures inferred from behavior which predisposes the person to behave uniformly across various circumstances and across time. Traits reflect the person's stable and predictable characteristics and are by far the most important of Cattell's concepts. Cattell relies heavily on factor analysis to investigate the structural elements of personality. He concludes that traits can be classified in several ways, such as surface traits, source traits, constitutional traits, environmental mold traits, ability traits, temperamental traits, dynamic traits, common traits and unique traits. Let us take up these traits and see how they function. First of all, we will discuss surface traits versus source traits. A surface trait is a set of behavioral characteristics that all seem to hang together. For instance, the observed characteristics of inability to concentrate, indecisiveness, restlessness, etc. may cluster together to form the surface traits of neuroticism. Here the trait of neuroticism is observed by a cluster of overt elements that seem to go together. It does not derive from any single factor or element. Surface traits do not have a unitary basis and are not consistent over time, and hence they are not given much value for behavioral accountability. On the other hand, source traits are the basic underlying structures which constitute the building blocks of personality. They represent the unitary dimension or factors that ultimately determine the consistencies in each person's observed behavior. Source traits exist at a deeper level of the personality and are the causes of behavior in diverse domains over an extended period of time. After extensive factor analytic research, Cattell concluded that there are approximately 16 source traits that constitute the underlying structure of personality. They are warmth, reasoning, emotional stability, dominance, liveliness, rule consciousness, social boldness, sensitivity, vigilance, abstractness, privateness, apprehension, openness to change, self-reliance, perfectionism and tension. 16PF, it's otherwise called 16 Personality Factor Questionnaire, designed by Cattell, consists of these personality trait factors. It's a self-report scale that has proved to be quite useful and popular in both applied and research settings. Cattell considered personality traits to have multi-level hierarchical structure. In his research, Cattell tried to find out the primary traits of personality and found that these primary traits came together in meaningful groupings and formed broader global traits. These global traits were termed by him as secondary traits. For example, the first global trait he found was the introversion-extroversion. It resulted from the natural affinity of 5 primary traits that defined different reasons for an individual to move toward people and away from people. Cattell stated that there was a natural tendency for these traits to go together in the real world, and these represented important behavioral domain. The primary traits that constituted the extroversion-introversion dimension were warmth, liveliness, social boldness, forthrightness and affiliate. Source traits can be divided into 2 subtypes depending on their origin. They are constitutional versus environmental mold traits. Constitutional traits derive from the biological and physiological conditions of the person. For instance, recovery from cocaine addiction may cause a person to be momentarily irritable, depressed and anxious. Cattell would suggest that these behaviors result from changes in the person's physiology and thus reflect constitutional source traits. Whereas environmental source traits are determined by influences in the social and physical environment. These traits reflect learned characteristics and styles of behaving and form a person. This is imprinted on the personality by the individual's environment. Thus, a person who is raised in rural setting behaves differently from a person who grows up in the urban area. Next division is ability, temperament and dynamic traits. Source traits can further be classified in terms of the modality through which they are expressed. Ability traits determine the person's skill and effectiveness in pursuing a desired goal. For example, intelligence and musical aptitude. Temperament traits relate to other emotional and stylistic qualities of behavior. For example, people may either work quickly or slowly on a task. Cattell considers temperament traits to constitutional source traits that determine a person's emotionality. Dynamic traits reflect the motivational elements of human behavior. These are traits that activate and direct the person toward particular goals. Thus, a person may be characterized as ambitious, power-oriented or interested in acquiring material possessions. Next category is common versus unique traits. A common trait is one that is shared in varying degrees by all members of the same culture. For example, self-esteem, intelligence and introversion. Unique traits are those that are shared by few or no other people. Unique traits are especially observed in the areas of interest and attitudes. Cattell gives much significance on use of factor analysis to identify the major traits of personality. Cattell draws his data from three basic sources. First is life record data, it is otherwise called L data, self-rating questionnaire data, that is Q data, and objective test data, that is OT data. L data involves a measurement of behavior in actual everyday situations such as school performance or interactions with peers. Q data refers to the person's self-ratings about his or her behavior, feelings or thoughts. Such information reflects the person's introspections and self-observations. Such data is prone to faking. Finally, OT data are derived from the creation of special situations in which the person's performance on certain tasks may be objectively scored. For example, responding to a Rorschach test. Such data is resistant to faking. Our next focus is Eysenck's trait type theory. Hans Georg Eysenck, or shortly H.J. Eysenck, his lifespan was between 1916 to 1997. He was a British psychologist. He was known for his theory of human personality. He suggested that personality is biologically determined and is arranged in a hierarchy consisting of types, traits, habitual responses and specific responses. Eysenck did not believe in Freudian psychoanalysis as he considered it rather unscientific. Next is hierarchical taxonomy enunciated by Hans J. Eysenck. According to Eysenck, personality can be studied from either temperamental or cognitive aspects or both. He focused on the temperament aspect of personality in his PEN model. Individual difference in personality or temperament is analyzed in terms of traits, which can be defined as theoretical constructs based on covariations of a number of behavioral acts.